Good morning, good afternoon, and for some of you, good evening. On behalf of the Canadian International Internet Dispute Resolution Center, or simply CIDRC, I extend a warm welcome to each of you who joined us today for our bilingual session titled Mastering Domain Name Disputes, Insights and Strategies for the Latin American Community. I'm Ina Ergasheva, the Director of Operations, and I'm delighted to have all of you join us today. For those unfamiliar with CIDRC, we're recognized by the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, or ICANN, as an approved dispute resolution provider, standing as one of only 6 globally approved UDRP providers. With over 2 decades of experience, we have served also as a trusted provider for the Canadian Internet Registration Authority, or CIRA, effectively handling disputes related to .ca domain names. Our mission is to facilitate neutral resolution of domain name disputes by providing procedural guidance to trademark owners challenging domain name ownership and domain name holders responding to complaints. Today's session promises valuable insights as we delve into brand protection and domain name disputes. We will explore common challenges faced by Latin American businesses. We will provide, as you will hear, a step-by-step guide to initiating a UDRP complaint. We will also cover the 3 UDRP elements, offer some practical tips for submitting a UDRP complaint, discuss factors considered by panelists in UDRP decisions, and review some notable cases. Please note, today's session will be recorded and published on the CII-DRC YouTube channel. Without further delay, I'm thrilled to introduce our distinguished panelists who have generously dedicated their time to prepare for today's session. Let me start with Mr. Gabriel Leonardos. He has a master's in law and he has more than 30 years of experience in intellectual property law. Mr. Leonardos is a senior partner of the Brazilian firm Kasnar Leonardos and is recognized by international ranking as one of the world's leading IP practitioners. He acts in litigation before the courts, advises on licensing agreements, patents, trademarks, trade secrets, copyrights, and unfair competition, and works as an arbiter and mediator in IP and contract law. He is the current president of Brazilian Association of Intellectual Property, or ABPI. Regarding domain name disputes, Mr. Leonardos has decades of experience as a WIPO panelist, also serving as panelist in the CII-DRC cohort of specialists for UDRP disputes. Our next presenter is Rodolfo Rivas. He's an expert in legal advice, negotiation, public policy, team management, communication, and government relations, with 20 plus years of international experience in the private and public sector. He is a frontline negotiator on 6 intergovernmental agreements, including the Trade Facilitation Agreement with an accrued global value of over $1 trillion. He is the revised government, he commented on revised government procurement agreement with market access coverage over 1.7 trillion per year, which is around 15 to 20% of global GDP. He is also associate professor of law at Universidad Panamericana on international economic law and a regular speaker on IP, policy, trade, and dispute settlement. He is also, very interestingly, creator, producer, and host of the Rodolfo Rivo Project podcast, ranked in the top 10 worldwide, top 10% worldwide, and is currently in the 6th session with over 380,000 downloads. Rodolfo is an arbitrator and domain name panelist with 80 panel decision adjudicating 236 domain names across forum, CAC, CIIDRC, ADNDRC, WIPO, and URS examiner at MFSD. Rodolfo holds an LLB from Universidad Panamericana in Guadalajara, Mexico, and LLM from Universidad de Alcant. Probably mispronounced it badly, so please forgive me. He also holds LLM from Stanford Law School and MBA from the University of London, and a Chief of Staff Executive certification from Saad Business School, University of Oxford. Our next presenter, very frequent one, Maria Alejandra Lopez Garcia. Joining us, Alex. Alex is a Venezuelan lawyer and industrial property agent. She brings over 20 years of experience in distinctive signs and domain names with both public and private sectors, spanning national and international arenas. Notably, her tenure with the WIPO Arbitration and Mediation Center oversees more than 500 UDRP and CCTLD disputes. Since 2017, she has spearheaded her own firm dedicated exclusively to resolving intellectual property rights infringement on internet. And Alex has been a member of our panel on UDRP and CDRP experts since 2020, delivering numerous decisions which are accessible through our website. And last and not least, Dr. Gustavo Moser, arbitration specialist, lawyer at LexisNexis in London, United Kingdom, counsel, panelist, and arbitrator in the practice areas of intellectual property, international commercial law, domestic and international sale and goods, and dispute resolution. He is qualified to practice law in Brazil, Portugal, and England and Wales. Gustavo has managed many hundreds of arbitrations and domain name disputes in his capacity as legal counsel at the London Court of International Arbitration and as a legal officer at the World Intellectual Property Organization, Arbitration and Mediation Center. His experience spans a variety of industry sectors, jurisdictions, applicable laws, and legal areas. Gustavo obtained his PhD in international commercial law from the University of Basel, Switzerland. He is multilingual, English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And now, without further ado, I will hand over the floor to our esteemed panelist, Alex, who will start her presentation. Alex, to you.
Thank you very much, Ina, for that incredible presentation. So as Ina said, this is a bilingual webinar that we decided to deliver for you. So I'm going to switch into Spanish. Sí, a ver, ¿qué les traje hoy? Yo voy a enfocarme principalmente en dos aspectos muy importantes que están muy vinculados con el entendimiento de las disputas en materias de nombres de dominio, que son la protección de las marcas en Internet, haciendo especial referencia a los programas de Brand Protection, y la ciberocupación en Latinoamérica. A ver, ¿rueda o no rueda? Creo que no está rodando. A ver, voy a... ¿me siguen o no? No. A ver, voy a volver a compartir, a ver si... A ver, creo que no, pero creo que hay un detalle aquí, un minuto. Bueno, denme un segundo, voy a volver a intentarlo. Ok, pero si no, pero me escuchan bien, entiendo que me escuchan, ¿verdad? Sí, buenísimo. A ver, bueno, quizá como esto, como dice Jeff Bezos, que no están, creo que es en Microsoft, que tampoco son muy proclives a utilizar presentaciones de PowerPoint. Pero a ver, lo que les he traído hoy en relación a a la protección de marcas en Internet es muy importante. A ver, ¿qué se puede conseguir en la práctica? Lo que he visto en la práctica es que ya no solamente la protección de la marca per se, es decir, su registro hoy en día, y sobre todo luego de la pandemia, muchas empresas que necesitaron digitalizarse. ¿Por qué? Porque el registro ya no es suficiente. O sea, simplemente registrar la marca y tenerla no va a garantizar su visibilidad. Sabemos que ya la marca tiene que ir evidentemente a un proceso de digitalización. ¿Y cómo pudiera empezar este proceso? Pues este proceso se inicia con llevar a la marca tanto a las redes sociales, pues de todas las que ya existen. Bueno, dependerá de cuál desee el cliente o cuál considera el cliente que es la plataforma más idónea. Posteriormente llevar esa marca a una página web, desarrollar un sitio web. Evidentemente, seleccionar un nombre de dominio, bien sea bajo una extensión digamos, de los viejos GTLDs, de los GTLDs, o de los nuevos GTLDs. O también, si se desea, puedes poder registrar el nombre de dominio en cualquier CCTLD de la jurisdicción que se considere más relevante. Digamos, yo diría que, bueno, dependerá siempre del presupuesto del cliente, ¿no? Si desea adquirir nombres de dominio defensivos o si desea poder adquirir nombres de dominio, registrarlo bajo el CCTLD que ellos consideren más idóneo. También, ¿qué forma parte del proceso de digitalización de una marca? Lo que he podido ver en la práctica, que la marca pues debe estar no solamente presente en las redes sociales, estar presente, exponerse en Internet, pero también si se trata de una marca sobre todo de productos, pues llevarla al marketplace, a cualquiera de los marketplaces o al e-commerce, ¿no? Que existe. Entonces, o de preferencia por la región y dependerá también del producto. Pero es muy importante tomar en cuenta que el e-commerce, por ejemplo, ya para el 2023, de acuerdo a ciertas empresas que realizan estos análisis minuciosos, el e-commerce puede representar hasta 6 millones de millones al cierre del año 2023. Esto también es un dato que les he traído de hecho tuvimos la oportunidad de tener un webinar con él, con David Barnett, en uno de sus libros que se especializa en el brand protection, en la protección de la marca, o sea, hacer todo este seguimiento de la marca en Internet y no solamente en una vigilancia en una o dos secciones, sino de manera bastante global, ¿no? Si desean conocer un poco más sobre en lo que consiste la protección de la marca en línea y todo lo que consiste un programa de brand protection, yo les sugeriría consultar con este autor que próximamente, de hecho, va a salir a la venta su nueva edición, aunque el libro actual se puede conseguir también por Amazon. Entonces, a ver, ¿qué sucede? La idea que yo les traigo aquí es que si una marca, o sea, hoy en día, y que está muy intrínsecamente relacionado con la ciberocupación, esos son los programas de Brand Protection. El programa de Brand Protection es, yo diría, hasta necesario, pues para poder hacer el seguimiento de esta marca en Internet en cualquiera de sus secciones, ¿no? Bueno, también hay que tomar en cuenta el aspecto de la marca de los sitios web falsos que pudieran surgir, que no necesariamente son casos entran dentro de lo que es un escenario de ciberocupación, pero que también entran de lo que es un programa de monitoreo y de brand protection. Entonces, en relación a la ciberocupación en Latinoamérica, lo que les he traído hoy, y bueno, esto lo pueden ver posteriormente cuando les circulemos las presentaciones, lo podrán ver y junto con el audio podrán ver siempre puede ocurrir un detalle técnico y bueno, y ya se resolverá posteriormente, pero bueno, hay que seguir adelante. Em, en relación a la ciberocupación en Latinoamérica, de acuerdo con las estadísticas del Centro de Arbitraje y Mediación de la OMPI, Latinoamérica apenas está representando un 3%. Em, es una cifra que a mí particularmente me sigue llamando la atención, pues porque creo que sigue habiendo un gran espacio y para muchísimas marcas y también para muchísimos titulares, nuevos titulares marcarios que se estén adentrando dentro de digamos, de empezar a navegar en esta especialidad o que están empezando a tener problemas con sus marcas en Internet, pues es importante tomar en cuenta todos los, digamos, las circunstancias y las aristas que pudiesen o que pudiesen, digamos, hacer que una marca aterrice en un caso de ciberocupación. Entonces, bueno, creo que con esto le estoy abriendo aquí el espacio a mi colega Rodolfo Rivas, quien les va a hablar un poco sobre cuáles serían estos detalles en relación a un procedimiento UDRP. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias, Alejandra, and thank you, Ina, for the presentation. Let me continue, and I'm going to continue in Spanish, bilingual session. Entonces, ¿sí se ve mi presentación?
Sí.
Entonces, ¿cómo se presenta una demanda? Es muy sencillo y se me hace que CIDRC tiene una guía muy fácil para que ustedes lo hagan. Hay básicamente dos formas que pueden hacerlo. Utilizando la plataforma, y ahí puse el link de la plataforma, lo pueden hacer directamente en línea. Ustedes acceden a este link y llenan todos los datos directamente ahí, y cuando estén listos para enviarla, simplemente le dan clic. Esa es una opción. La otra opción, si son un poco más old school o tradicionales, lo pueden hacer utilizando un formato que viene también en la misma página. Lo bajan en su computadora y lo llenan en su computadora, tomando en cuenta que no deben de exceder 5,000 palabras, y después lo envían al centro por correo. Ahí viene el correo. Y esta es son las dos formas básicas para presentar la demanda de una forma muy user-friendly. Después también se tienen que pagar las tasas. Al momento que se presenta la demanda son $400, y después, dependiendo de si es uno o a tres dominios, son $1,000 extra para el fee, las tasas del experto, o también si se va a requerir un panel de tres. Pero eso no me voy a enfocar ahorita, solo para que sepan que para presentar una demanda se puede hacer muy fácil a través de la plataforma del centro. Eh, y también en esa misma página donde viene esta información, viene una pequeña guía que es una especie de checklist de qué es lo que deben de incluir en la demanda. Desafortunadamente, en mi experiencia, muchas veces los demandantes parece que ni siquiera leen este checklist porque incluyen muchos errores en su demanda. Si pudieran leer este checklist, eh, serían un trabajo más fácil para ellos y también eventualmente un trabajo más fácil para el panelista. Y últimamente es bueno que sea fácil para el panelista, porque si el trabajo del panelista es más fácil, se puede enfocar más en los hechos y no tanto en los hechos y las pruebas y no tanto en tratar de desentrañar la demanda. ¿Qué se requiere? Son cuatro guías que presenta este checklist. La primera y la más importante es que se tiene que tener y demostrar claramente la titularidad de una marca. ¿Cómo se hace esto? Usualmente la forma más sencilla es incluir una copia del certificado de registro o cualquier otra evidencia clara que respalde su derecho sobre la marca. Se sorprenderían que muchas veces esto que es tan sencillo no está incluido. Lo segundo, incluir como anexo copia del quiz. ¿Por qué es importante? Porque incluye información de la fecha del registro. Tal vez la información de la identidad del titular del nombre de dominio no viene ahí por cuestiones de privacidad, pero simplemente saber la fecha y saber que estamos hablando del verdadero del nombre de dominio en cuestión. Tercero, proporcionar toda la información que se tenga en relación al demandado. Muchas veces cuando se presenta la demanda, no se tiene la información completa del demandado. Esto se proporciona después. En este momento, cuando se proporciona esta información, se tiene que revisar los argumentos que sean relevantes y refiriéndose a la identidad del demandado. De hecho, no sé qué porcentaje de las demandas participan, no lo hacen. Usualmente cuando se proporciona la información, básicamente lo único que hacen es cambiar el nombre del demandado sin revisar los argumentos. Eso sería algo que tendrían que poner atención, porque muchas veces sí tienen implicaciones en sus argumentos. Y ya que este procedimiento es un procedimiento sumario, no existe posibilidad de presentar nuevos argumentos, salvo excepciones, pero para todos efectos prácticos, es solo una instancia y solo una oportunidad de presentar argumentos. Y el último punto es que deben de incluir argumentos específicos y no generales, y referirse exclusivamente a las pruebas que son relevantes y proporcionar estas pruebas. Si siguen estos cuatro pasos, ya van muy adelante de los que presentan demandas en cualquier lugar, no solo en este centro, sino en cualquiera de los demás centros. Y estoy hablando de abogados experimentados o también como usuarios titulares de marca que muchas veces también presentan sus demandas propias. ¿Cuáles son los tres elementos? Em, los tres elementos están especificados en la póliza, en la política UDRP, y cuando se está presentando la demanda, no solo se tienen que hacer alegatos, sino también con pruebas. Algo muy importante es que la política UDRP tiene un estándar general de prueba que se conoce como preponderancia de la evidencia o balance de probabilidades. ¿Qué significa esto? Según este estándar, una parte afirmante necesitaría establecer que lo que afirma es lo más probable. Este es un estándar de prueba un poco menos fuerte que lo que se llevaría a cabo en una corte doméstica, pero como estamos hablando de un procedimiento sumario, se entiende, y como muchas veces las partes no responden a la demanda y no hay pruebas disponibles, se trata de un estándar de balance de probabilidades. ¿Qué es lo más probable? Ahora, ¿cuáles son los tres elementos? Los tres elementos se tienen que probar. Es una especie de escalera. El uno, 2 y 3 se tienen que probar los tres para succeed en una demanda. El primer elemento es que el nombre de dominio sea idéntico o similar hasta el punto de confundirse con una marca. ¿Cómo se prueba esto? La similitud puede ser de manera visual, incluso de manera fonética, y usualmente se hace una comparación en paralelo. Cuando la política fue creada, la intención fue de atender a la mayoría de los casos que eran typo squatting. Esto ya no es exactamente lo que pasa ahora, pero esto fue lo que inspiró la política y es lo que motiva gran parte del contenido de la política. Entonces, pruebas la marca y pruebas que es similar hasta el punto de confundirse. ¿Cuál es el segundo elemento? Se tiene que demostrar que el titular, el demandado, no tiene derechos ni intereses legítimos respecto al nombre de dominio. Si tú eres un demandante, ¿cómo pruebas algo negativo? No se puede, pero lo que sí puedes hacer es presentar un caso prima facie, presentando algunos de los argumentos y te puedes basar en la lista no exhaustiva que viene en el párrafo 4C de la política, que puede ser argumentos que el demandado no se conoce por ese nombre, no ha adquirido derechos marcarios, está haciendo un uso no legítimo comercial del nombre de dominio. Si tú pruebas esto de manera prima facie, se revierte la carga de la prueba y ahora le toca al demandado presentar argumentos al respecto. Y como dije, el estándar de prueba es balance de probabilidades. Nos vamos al tercer elemento y este es el que a mí en personal más me gusta porque es el más interesante y se tiene que demostrar la mala fe tanto al momento del registro como al momento de la utilización. Y similar al elemento número 2, el párrafo 4b establece una lista no exhaustiva de circunstancias que pueden indicar la mala fe del demandado. Eh, el que usualmente es más común es que es el último y este es un poco como el catch-all de este elemento, y es que el demandado intentó intencionalmente atraer con fines de lucro comercial a los usuarios de Internet al sitio web del demandado u otra ubicación, creando una probabilidad de confusión con la marca. Esto básicamente son los tres elementos. La verdad es que es muy sencillo y con esto paso a inglés con mis concluding thoughts para mi parte. To file a dispute, you can use the available tools at CIIDRC, which are available through their website. You can do it online through the system, or if you are a bit more traditional, you can send it through a document by email. Remember to always address carefully the three elements. You only get one chance. There's the exceptions, but treat it as if it's only one chance. And whenever you find more information regarding the identity of the domain name holder, please update your arguments and your whole complaint. Do not just focus on the identity because it can have implications to your complaint. And you can only succeed if you satisfy the three elements. But that's what I had to say. Now we can move on to the next presenter. Thank you.
And our next presenter is Gustavo. He will be speaking about the practical tips for submitting a UDRP complaint.
Thank you, Ina. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to join today's rather distinguished panel, and my gratitude to you, Ina, for the invitation. So I'll be sharing today some practical considerations on how to maximize your chances to succeed in a UDRP case. It's certainly not a one-size-fits-all formula, but instead sort of a roadmap, or if we want to say a framework within which to increase your chances, increase the odds of prevailing in a UDRP dispute. Some of the considerations I will be sharing are likely to resonate with what you have experienced in your daily practice, or also to overlap with what had been discussed today. But I'm very hopeful that there'll be some take-home messages from my talk. So I'll be moving to the business of today. So we'll be discussing the first part of the presentation, project managing a UDRP case, some key steps. And then a second and last part, I will be taking you through a UDRP panel's mind, a snapshot, unveiling the main tools and factors that will likely convince a panel to rule in your favor. Right, so to kick off with the project managing a UDRP case, some key steps. So here I would like to, first of all, point out the understanding the applicable legal framework. This step consists of understanding both the hard law and soft law, so hardware the governing law, the UDRP policy, UDRP rules, but also the supplemental rules, for example, the Canadian Centre. And soft law being the case law from various different UDRP providers, overviews, guidance notes, checklists, practical guidance from different stakeholders, best practices, so on and so forth. So first and foremost, understanding the applicable legal framework. Just a reminder that obviously national trademark and copyright laws won't govern UDRP disputes, whilst lawyers might be tempted to at times raise the argument that a respondent has violated a certain domestic law or infringed the rights of third parties, copyrights. Panels have no jurisdiction to rule on such claims. What do you have to prove to succeed? Remember to stick to the point, the three elements that Rodolfo has discussed earlier, and that would complete the first point of my step. The second step, which is a lot meatier, is the taking of evidence. So here I presented in bullet points some of the factors which are, in my view, critical and paramount to obtaining the taking of evidence and frankly, winning your UDRP dispute. So starting with the critical fact checking, I would say thorough research of the domain name, the registration, the use, screenshots of the contemporary use, but also the archive history of the website at which the domain name resolves. That could all be useful evidence for building up your arguments, building up and putting flesh on the bones of the three elements. Identity of respondent, that can lead to a evidence of pattern of abuse, for example, or may indicate that the respondent has rights or legitimate interest in the domain name. So that is extremely important as well. Now, how you may elicit that information, how you may obtain that information, you can obviously contact the registrar, attempt to contact the registrar, but you may also attempt to contact the host of any website that the domain name points to. So I would suggest that you check the host terms and conditions in case of any breaches and flag this in the request. So a website host may be able to provide information in case you are unable to identify the respondent. Likewise, the website host may be able to temporarily or permanently disable the respondent's website. So that's the one way to also obtain further evidence. And obviously establishing contact with the registrar, if unsuccessful, consider perhaps ICANN compliance team. Complainant and respondent's activity. Here I would flag digging for information about the respondent's activity, if any, segment of business, whether it's similar, whether it's potentially similar to the complainant, and really any potential interest associated with the domain name that can be unveiled from that research of the complainant respondent activities. Now, pre-action correspondence, and that I find of particular relevance. If you have corresponded with the respondent, and if you haven't done so, I would recommend you to do prior to commencing a UDRP complaint, append. So I would say append any cease and desist letter, any correspondence you have exchanged with the respondent, showing that you have attempted to resolve the matter prior to commencing the case. Consider doing so if you haven't yet before filing. And I would say be clear that you have a cause of action under the UDRP policy and explain why with clear undertakings. And I'd say that because this might assist in convincing the panel that to draw, for example, adverse inferences from the silence or from the lack of inaction from the respondent side. Furthermore, this also can be interesting because in case you obtain a response to your pre-action letter, that could build up your argument of perhaps respondent has registered with a speculative nature in mind, and that could also be an evidence of bad faith later on when you are looking at the third element. And finally, still on the pre-action correspondence, I would say to monitor the respondent's behavior following the letter, following the correspondence. For example, has the respondent put up a website unrelated to the complainant's activities following or after having received the letter? So our panel will, and more certainly may view this as a sort of smoke screen for an abusive registration. So monitor that as well, and collect that evidence and present that, append that to the request. Identifying patterns and anomalies, again, looking at the respondent's identity and checking case search to understand whether the respondent has participated in all the domain name disputes, has prevailed or not, has registered all the domain names, a similar pattern of behavior that can be also a good evidence to collect at this stage. Then establishing UDRP relevant rights, the threshold for establishing rights is fairly low, covering not only registered trademarks in any jurisdiction, but also in certain specific cases, personal names or unregistered trademarks and even geographical indications. I would say if the complainant has registered trademarks and those marks predate the registration of the domain name, then the first element is very straightforward. Say not forget to provide a copy of the registration certificate from any jurisdiction. However, preferably the jurisdiction in which the respondent resides or appears to reside according to the WHOIS data, according to the information you have collected, or where the respondent is incorporated if it's an entity, it's a legal person. Another reminder, perhaps a step in the project managing mindset would be if a complainant is a licensee or relies on register rights that do not directly belong to the complainant, make sure that the request is clear as to how the complainant has legal standing to bring the complaint, right? And importantly, append any appropriate document evidence confirming that status of legal standing. So that would be also at this stage of the taking of evidence. Finally, if the complainant trademark is well known, I would suggest to make that argument and then support with evidence. As we know, the strength and weakness of the mark will also be a factor influencing the panel analysis about the registrant's rights and the bad faith element. So make sure you address that and you provide sufficient evidence. If a mark is well known, of course, respondent is more likely to have heard of that mark and to be deliberately targeting that mark. So I would suggest to add either links or copies of the other decisions, for example, where panels have found that a certain mark is well known, any certificate where that has been acknowledged as well. And if you're unable to do that, but still believe that there is a well-known, some factors would include also awards, advertising spend, statistics from website analytics, and how long has the company been established, turnover, so on and so forth. lots of data that would attempt to convince the panel that the mark is well known as well. Lastly, if you're arguing if that is that you need to establish right in a unregistered trademark, obviously that is it's the burden is higher. So and then you might have to look into different factors: duration, continuity of the mark, sales, advertisement efforts, money spent, sales figures, its consumer service, etc. That is a much higher threshold. So that completes the second step. Now moving on to the third out of 4 steps, the early case assessment. So now here I would consider a sort of analysis, a cost-benefit analysis, whether recovering the domain name, how much would cost, lawyers' fees, you have management time, you have the UDP service providers' fees, and then considering that cost within that umbrella of, do I have a strong case, it's worth filing a UDP complaint on the basis of all the evidence collected as well, noting the risks of reverse domain name hijacking. Do I have a straightforward, more nuanced factual legal matrices? If the case is more nuanced, maybe considering whether a 3-member panel be more suitable. Obviously, there are cost consequences, but maybe an opportunity to nominate someone who might be more aligned with your legal position as well. So early case assessment, I recommend doing that prior to filing a UDP complaint, and assessing that in the order of having already collected, having already produced the documentary evidence of the point 2, which we just discussed. And then finally, it might sound a bit basic, but I would still will say that drafting an effective complaint, clarity and concision, so addressing all 3 elements in a very clear way, avoiding grandiloquent and irrelevant statements, unnecessary arguments, and annexes. Numerous screenshots may not be necessary unless you're proving a specific point. Numerous trademark registration certificates might not be necessary unless you are proving a specific point. So think carefully about how you are proving the 3 elements under the policy. So stick to what you have to prove. Avoid sidestepping, avoiding going to tangents, satisfy the threshold with evidence backing. And if there are any cases that might assist, might be beneficial, I would say to also use that authoritative case law. Again, it's a soft law, but has authority, has a persuasive power. So the take-home message here is be succinct and focus on evidence, and really evidence backing every single element being discussed under the policy. Now I'm moving to the second and final part of my presentation, which is the UDP panel's mind, really a snapshot. And I will take you through a few elements which I consider, again, also critical when a panel is assessing a UDP case. And obviously for you as a lawyer, as a filer, also to consider whilst writing and submitting a UDP complaint. Again, applicable legal framework. Let's remember there's a narrow jurisdictional scope here. It's adjudication of domain names. There are 2 remedies available only: cancellation or transfer. No other remedies may be sought. The 3 elements are cumulative. So if you fail to prove one of them, you lose. And likely also from a respondent's point of view, if you are able to prove one of them, you prevail in the case if you're representing a respondent, for example. So limited scope, narrow jurisdictional scope. However, also discretion to apply rules and principles of law. So although in my experience rare in practice, some principles of equity may be applicable. For example, panelists deciding whether to grant a request for change of language of proceedings or request for consolidation of proceedings. So that's at the end of the day will be a judgment of a deservingness, who deserves to remain with that domain name. So remember that discretion as well, which is panels have that in mind when deciding a UDRP case. Secondly, the nature of the UDRP proceedings, let's not forget, is a documents-only proceedings. It's a fast track. It's a fast track case. It's time sensitive. Panelists will have 14 days. They're given 14 days to make a decision. There is limited evidence as well if you compare to all the types of proceedings. So that is also an element of consideration or factor that influence a panel. And finally, and I'm coming to the end of my intervention, evidence-driven, which is really the core point of UDRP decisions. And I'll highlight two main points. One, the burden of proof. Let's remember, lies with the party asserting allegation of fact. So complainant who is seeking the legal remedy has the burden of proof or onus of proof. Might have the benefit of adverse inference, for example, when if respondent fails to respond to a procedural order or respondent fails to submit a response, that panels are allowed to draw adverse inferences from that silence, from that lack of action. So that's the burden of proof. The complainant has the burden by bringing that claim. And the standard of proof, let's also not forget, when we are taking the evidence, let's not forget what panels are looking, what's the standard adopted, which is the level of certainty that must be reached, must be obtained to prove a fact. So it's a balance of probabilities. So what's more likely to have occurred, the fact is more probably to occur than not, is not a criminal standard, is a civil procedural standard, it's a balance of probability. So evidence is stacked in a party's favor, 51%. It's what you need. So that serves both ways if you either representing a complainant or a respondent. So bear that in mind, that standard of proof, the balance of probabilities, and bear in mind the burden of proof that you, as a complainant representative, you have the burden to, when asserting an allegation of fact, to prove that, to back that with sufficient evidence. So these are my considerations. I thank you all, and I'll pass the mic to my next fellow panelist. Thank you.
Mr. Leonardis, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So there's not much left to be said after the presentations from Maria Alejandra, Rodolfo, and Gustavo. I'd like to start by thanking Ina for putting together this panel, and congratulations for the excellent work being done by the Canadian International Center. And before my part was to speak a little bit about notable cases. So I tried to pick only four cases, to give you an example of disputes concerning domain names in Latin America. But I think what we have heard so far, it's very important and should be highlighted. Rodolfo mentioned in detail the criterion of bad faith. And whenever we read the decisions, we have to remember that the UDRP is a system that was created to relieve the burden of the courts in clear-cut cases. And there are three elements, but the first element, if a trademark is similar to a previous trademark, if the domain name is similar to a previous trademark, is very straightforward. The second element, lack of legitimacy by the respondent. Well, as Rodolfo mentioned, it can be assumed the respondent has no legitimacy and that the respondent may simply present a reasonable explanation. And then the second element will be lacking. But the bad faith, what is interesting is that the complainant, and in our terminology, for those who are not really used to that, so basically the complainant is the plaintiff, and the respondent is the defendant. So the complainant, he must go to some length to show the bad faith. As Gustavo mentioned, it is the burden of proof lies on the complainant. And the bad faith in this case is a subjective bad faith. It is a fraud, deceit, an intent. So, of course, you can always assume there is bad faith because of the actions of the respondent, and there are a lot of tips and hints in the materials that can assist anyone drafting a complaint. But without the bad faith, the dispute will never be ruled in favor of the complainant. That doesn't mean that the complainant has no rights at all, because sometimes the complainant has rights that can only be asserted through a court of law and not through this very limited procedure, which is the UDRP. So sometimes I even draft decisions and explaining that to the decision. The fact that this complaint is not granted because of the limitations of the system doesn't mean that the complainant is precluded from his or her rights to achieve a remedy through the courts, which of course can make a much broader analysis. The other initial remark that I would like to make, Gustavo mentioned very briefly, is the fact that sometimes they are rare, but I've made them and we all made them, and sometimes the panelist, the specialist drafting the decision, he or she may issue a procedural order. Whenever there is a procedural order, this may be directed to the complainant or to the respondent. You really have to answer it very thoroughly, because basically the specialist is giving you a chance to prove better your case or to prove better your defense. If you don't use this chance, you will lose. If you don't take seriously the procedural order, you will lose. It doesn't matter which side you are. So the procedural order is a measure of fairness, of due process, that in some cases it is applicable, but they are not very common. So the first case I would like to share with you is Costa Rica recovery. Very interesting case. It was decided by the CEI-DRC. I think maybe it was Maria Alejandra who decided it, if I remember well. And the interesting, well, it's difficult to read because the images are always in front of the slide. Just a second. Okay. So the interesting thing is that it was assumed that it was a non-registrable expression in Costa Rica, and this domain name and the common law trademark was used to a facility for recovery of addiction, for people suffering from addiction. And so it was accepted that it was a common law trademark, but it was shown secondary meaning. So this is very important. Whenever you don't have a registered trademark, you really have to spend some effort and time in order to show that you have common law trademark rights. And this is a very common case. The domain name registration was in the name of a marketing company that used to render services to the complainant. And even in what appeared to be a further attempt of fraud, the marketing company had assigned the domain name to a natural person shortly before the complaint was filed. But the main excuse of the marketing company was that the complainant owed $50,000 for services rendered and not paid. So the idea that registrants, someone owning a domain name, is trying to have some kind of retention right or to hold the domain name for ransom because it has other possible credits against the complainant is not uncommon. But that's not an excuse. Anyone who has some money to collect has to go through the proper channels and not hijack a domain name to try to be paid. So this was a finding of bad faith. And there are a lot of cases involving names of countries and names of cities. I'm not going into that, but this is also a fascinating area of domain name disputes. But in this case, there was clearly some common law trademark, so trademark without registration. And so the complaint was granted. The complaint was granted. The other case was very interesting also, Todo en Subastas.net. Todo en Subastas, of course, I think everybody here understands well Spanish, everything in auctions. It is a Mexican company, and they had the trademark Todo en Subastas, which was registered 9 years before. So they could show that the domain name holder was using the domain name in bad faith. It was even using a copy of the trademark, of the designs and the commercial model. So all this shows the bad faith, the intention to pass off as the rightful domain name owner who is the complainant. Third case, that also happens very often. B3 is the Brazilian stock market. The Brazilian stock market used to be called Bovespa, as in Bolsa de Valores de São Paulo. And then some years ago, they decided this was not attractive, sexy, modern anymore. And as very often happens, they made a modernization of the brand, and they started to be called B3 because it was a combination of 3 different stock markets. That was B3. And then these domain names were b3.money and b3money.com. And what's interesting is that the stock market announced they were going to change the name, and a few days later, someone had registered the domain names. So at that moment, when the domain name was registered, B3, the Brazilian stock market, still didn't have filed the trademark application, but it did later on to obtain registration. So this was a case in which it had to, the bad faith was very important because of the large publicity of the announcement they were going to change the name, they were adopting a new name. So this was also another granted case. This was an important case for Brazil. Can you imagine? That's the stock market. One of the largest, if not the largest, in Latin America. This was decided by WIPO. In the last case I'm going to share with you, which I think it's worth just for you to get to know as a matter of example, is that UDRP, of course, is applicable to several general top-level domains like .com, .net. And several countries adopted UDRP as well. Other countries have their own systems. Brazil adopted its own system, and which was really strongly based in UDRP. I will point out in the end the very few differences. But this might happen elsewhere in Latin America. I know other countries have their own systems, but there might also be several service providers for each country domain name disputes. And this case was a hijacking of the famous trademark 7-Eleven. You see, that was a .com.br name, domain name. So it had to be decided under the Brazilian rules, which on that matter, 7-Eleven was a famous trademark in Brazil, already registered. So it was, I would say, straightforward case that it was granted. The Brazilian system is known as SACI. SACI stands for Sistema Administrativo de Conflitos da Internet. But actually, this name was created clearly so that the acronym SACI could be used, because SACI is this character of the Brazilian folklore, very well known in Brazil. It's a small boy with only one leg who smokes a pipe and drives a hurricane, a tornado. So it's very famous in the Brazilian folklore. So it is, the name has this nice exception. And when we were creating the SACI system in 2010, we used all the experience from the ODRP, and we adopted a few other causes for action. So in Brazil, in a .com.br dispute, not only a trademark may be used as a basis for the complaint, but also other rights like family name, artistic names, other domain names. So the Brazilian system is more generous in terms of causes of action. But what is really, really strict, and that's coming back to my first point, is that the bad faith must be shown. Sometimes we as specialists, we feel that, oh my God, this is not really smelling right. I think there was some fraud, but unless we have clear proof of bad faith in the documents, as Gustavo mentioned, you only have the documents. You cannot hear testimonies. There are no hearings. So unless you have this proof, we are obliged to rule against the complainant. And that will only leave the complainant if he or she wants to discuss the matter again, the recourse to a court of law, which is much more expensive and much more complicated. So that in a nutshell, I think it's what I would like to bring to you today. Thank you. Ina, I think it's back to you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. What an exciting and rich hour we just had. As we conclude this session, I would like to extend my gratitude to those who joined us today, and most importantly, appreciation to our panelists, to Alex, to Rodolfo, to Gustavo, and to Gabriel for making this very insightful presentation. So thank you very much, and I hope it's just the beginning of our joint collaboration. Please feel free to email us at resolution@ciidrc.org if you wish to for us to organize sessions on any specific topic or delve in deeply into a specific area of domain name dispute resolution. We will be more than happy to do so. And with that, thank you again, and have a wonderful day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.